Hello again, Dr. Franz here. Let me give some final information and reflections on the steam locomotives and some of the future developments and legacies. I left off last time musing how you, as a worker on that first transcontinental railroad, would be so amazed at the progress of the railroad since then. But I also mentioned how many were seriously injured or killed while working on that railroad, the transcontinental. Let me say that the casualties did not stop. News articles recorded the high death rate among train crews. Until the 1880s, when air brakes became widely used, each railroad car had its own brakes. The brakemen traversed the top of the trains in whatever weather or icy conditions to turn the wheel to apply the brakes, then to jump to the next car. It is very dangerous. Many men were crushed between cars because of the needed manipulation of the coupling between cars, or not hearing a train behind you because of another train's noise. Just in the year 1888, 2,017 railroad men died in accidents. In 1893, the Railroad Safety Appliance Act was passed that improved railroad safety, like making sure new couplers were used that did not require men to work between the cars. But 1893, well, that's about 60 years or 2 generations into railroad history. Now back to that point about railroad expansion. By 1893, there were a handful of different east-to-west connections, and the railroad industry had quadrupled since the Transcontinental Railroad. Notice these maps showing railroad growth in this golden age. Many songs were written about trains. The blues song Berta sings, "When you marry, marry a railroad man. Every day Sunday, $1 in your hand." Trains became a popular part in many novel plots and a theme in art. I think I mentioned last time that silent movies came out like The Great Train Robbery in 1903, and then Buster Keaton in The General, 1927, based on a true Civil War story. When Edison's kinetoscope came out in 1892, it did not take long to film steam trains. Here's 2 short silent clips from these early years, and watch for the boy on his bicycle, my favorite part. Love the boy racing the train until his path was obstructed was probably the highlight of each day for him. Now, my late grandfather, Leslie, born in 1907, I think, told me as a kid about his hometown in rural Missouri, a railroad town. He remembers the hillbillies who ventured into town on occasion, running from the train as it came through. He told me what a privilege it was for someone to work for the railroad in his town, Thayer, Missouri. A highly prized job. Everyone respected and looked up to them, not just because they had steady work, but because their work was so important to the nation. They were helping this country succeed. At the end of this street, you can look and just see the railroad tracks. The railroad made this town successful, and my grandfather more successful in his shoe business. The railroad tied towns socially and economically to tens of thousands of other cities. The sights and sounds of the trains were a regular reminder. Across this nation, the railroad significantly contributed to the numerical and business growth of countless towns and cities, as well as creating countless other cities. Without the railroad, we might hardly know of Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Fort Worth, Tacoma, Reno, Fresno, Cheyenne, Billings, and Albuquerque. Not only did the railroad make cities, it certainly contributed to states. Now let me take my home state of Florida as an example. Certainly the trains helped populate Florida from the 1880s through the 1920s. Two great business tycoons, Henry Plant and Henry Flagler, provided the money and vision to extend railroads down the east and west coasts, and helped put towns like Tampa and Miami, and even Fort Myers and Naples, on the map. Notice the work of Henry Plant in green, with tracks and hotels, and Henry Flagler in red. In 1880, Tampa had 720 people. Henry Plant brought the railroad there in 1883, and by 1900 there were over 15,000, and that doubled each decade from 1910 to 1930. And because they were connected to the railroad, they were able to secure the Cuban cigar industry from Key West to Tampa and Ybor City there. The railroads made towns successful then. In 1880, Miami wasn't even incorporated, but the county had 100 people. Then Henry Flagler bought the railroad in 1896. Miami was incorporated that year, and by 1900, 4 years later, it had 1,681 people. By 1910, about 5,500. By 1920, almost 30,000. By 1930, over 110,000. They were on their way to being the Miami we think about today. Flagler and Plant built fine hotels along the railroads in these growing cities. Florida's pool was their warm summers and great fishing, but who wanted to take a long, debilitating trip here by boat or horse cart before the automobile and good roads? But they will take a train. The railroad came to Fort Myers in 1904 and, of course, contributed to the population and business growth. Fort Myers did some advertising in 1904, shortly after the railroad came, and they were hoping for a few hundred people to visit. Instead, they got 1,700, which sent them scrambling for food, entertainment, and lodging for them. Then the train extended to Bonita Springs by 1924, and by 1927 to Naples, putting them on the map and on the road to more notable and prosperous cities. These small stories of Tampa, Miami, Fort Myers, and Naples help us to understand the big story, namely that this same thing was happening all across this nation, or at least many parts of this nation, that the railroad significantly contributed to the numerical and business growth of countless towns and cities. In our 20th century world wars, trains moved American soldiers around this country. Notice the posters. Give them room on trains. And here's a war job for you on the railroad. My late mother, who was age 7 through 11 during World War II, shared with me how her mother, my grandmother, and her used to travel by train in Missouri sometimes. My grandmother would always bake cookies and give bags of them to the servicemen on the trains. Before World War II, railroads employed between 1.5 and 2 million people, about 10% of all industrial workers. But as you know, after the war in the 1950s, there was a big decline in passenger trains because people wanted to drive their cars, and they wanted to drive them on the new highways in the Eisenhower administration and after. And trains had been changing from steam power. Electric trains in the cities were brought out in the 1880s, and also electric trolley cars. And then, of course, the underground trains or subways. Underground, they cannot use steam power because of the smoke. Areas with tunnels were changed to electric trains. Later they developed fuel engines, namely diesel engines in the 1920s and 30s, and then the hybrid diesel-electric, where electricity was generated as they went. The change from steam to these other kinds of trains, well, that's a whole another story, including how American passenger travel diminished, and how the American freight trains had an up and down history but now is going very strong. This freight train map looks as strong as the passenger trains used to be. But passenger travel still is used. Amtrak was created in 1971 and is subsidized by the government. There are lots of local train companies and commuter trains. Just in the last years, Brightline opened a fast 125-mile-per-hour train between Orlando and Miami, with stops at the major cities between. And there's plans for similar ventures in other states. But compared to Asia and Europe, our passenger train services now are limited. My daughter and I enjoyed making our way across Western Europe by fast trains. And I, like many, have commented how Europe puts us to shame with their passenger trains. But after doing this study, I've decided not to frame it that way anymore. America chose to drive and fly over passenger trains since the 1950s. We don't need to match how Asia and Europe do passenger travel any more than they need to copy our freight trains. They have their own unique geography and how they do things, and we have ours. I also want to say that I've been speaking about locomotives and trains, but I want to make it clear that I'm talking about not just the physical trains, but also the many thousands of locomotive and train crew members. They tended to be extremely loyal to their trains and to each other. We owe them a lot of respect and thanks for all they've done through our history. They helped build and expand America. Today there are many steam locomotive enthusiasts and fans for all kinds of trains. Eat, sleep, trains, repeat. How many here loved electric trains as a kid or adult? Today we look back with awe to that golden age of railroads, where the people almost certainly took for granted the steam locomotives all around them, just like we take so much for granted around us. For instance, there are fans of the Union Pacific Big Boy steam train that was restored in May 2019 to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad. Catch this train starting and going down the track, and notice how it builds up speed. Last time I checked, which was many months ago, this had 6.4 million views in 2 years. And there were, at that time, over 4,000 comments. And they weren't, "Come on, people, it's just a train." They were in awe. Again, what was just part of the landscape 150 years ago, these modern fans are amazed with, which is an interesting dynamic to ponder. I conclude with some of their comments. Does anyone else literally start to tear up watching this? It's just incredible to see this magnificent machine running. What an honor, and how it must feel for the engineers of this amazing piece of equipment to not only drive this huge hulk of a beast, but to see all the fans coming out to honor its continuing journey on the rails. The sheer violence of all that metal working in perfect harmony, truly stunning. What a beast of a machine! It looks so elegant yet powerful, truly a product of a grittier and more sophisticated era. And finally, these beautiful machines move the world forward with such presence and character. Thanks very much.